Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my channel and this series where I interview different people about music and their experiences with music. Today, I'm joined by Abby Roth. Abby is a professional opera singer and more recently, a rising influencer on YouTube and across social media. Thank you for joining me, Abby.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This should be fun.
hmm So I came across your content on YouTube and through Twitter, and I think some in the last 2 years. Can you tell me a little bit about how, as a professional opera singer, what kind of got you started and YouTube and this little niche that you've carved for yourself, and if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my channel is called Classically Abby. And the reason that I came up with that name, and it's kind of part and parcel of the story, is that I was a professional opera singer. I have 3 degrees in operatic performance from USC and from Manhattan School of Music. And while I was singing, I really loved it, but I realized when I met my husband that I didn't think that this lifestyle was going to be conducive to the life I wanted, which was being around for my kids and having a good marriage. Opera is really, really hard to pursue and do those things. You're traveling constantly and it's just really difficult. And on top of that, you're in the leftist art world. So having any sort of conservative perspectives is just not really allowed. You can get blacklisted if you talk about that kind of thing. And so I basically made the choice after graduating that I wanted to figure out something I could do that would embrace my singing, embrace my classic living and traditional values, and share it with other people, and also give me the flexibility to be at home and raise my children and be with my husband. So I decided to start my channel, and I called it Classically Abby because I'm a classical singer. I sing opera, and also I believe in classic living and traditional values. And that's kind of how I got my start, which was kind of the whole idea in the first place.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. I've kind of seen some of your content on and off, and it's you've managed to find, I think, a very an interesting niche. It was not something within the sort of cultural commentary and I guess the kind of landscape of whatever existed at the time, which I think it's probably been 3 years now that you've been
Mhm.
doing this.
Yeah.
I think yeah, I think a lot of the existing kind of popular figures in the commentary world, a lot of them were maybe even not intentionally, but they were geared towards more male audiences.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think you've kind of built a very interesting platform for yourself. So,
Thank you.
kind of going off what you were saying about how before YouTube you were an opera singer. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how, before getting into YouTube, how you got into opera. I know you mentioned growing up you were influenced a lot by Maria Callas, the
Mhm.
opera singer, and
Absolutely.
Ella Fitzgerald, I think, was another one. And
Mhm.
yeah, so I'd love it if you can get a little bit into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was about 16, my dad, who is a pianist, he gave me for Hanukkah a gift, and that gift was a voice lesson with an opera singer. And so I went to that opera singing lesson and had no expectations, was just like, okay, let's see what this is. And at the end of the lesson, the teacher said to me, you could do this as a career. And I said this, and I said to her, people don't do this for money. And then proceeded to try and do this for money. I loved it. I just absolutely loved singing, and I loved the art of opera. Growing up, I'd been raised on all these different kinds of music, including classical. And my favorite videotape when I was 2 years old was The Magic Flute by Ingmar Bergman. I always get it confused, Ingmar or Ingrid.
Mhm.
Ingmar Bergman. And he had made this incredible version of the Magic Flute that I just grew up watching, and I couldn't even read the subtitles. I'm sure I had no idea what was going on, but the music spoke to me at 2 years old. And I always loved that. So when I started singing opera, it was kind of funny. My family laughed because that had been such a unique part of my
Mhm.
childhood. And I pursued that I would get home from rehearsals. I was in school plays at 10 p.m. and I was like, okay, time to practice. Let's go. And so I just loved singing. And when I did that, I ended up applying to USC and was very lucky to get a full scholarship to attend there and pursue my career. And then I decided to continue with that into my master's and my professional studies certificate at the Manhattan School of Music, where I had some amazing opportunities. I've actually been on a couple of recordings that are available on Spotify, which was really cool. And I also got to perform at the Aspen Music Festival right after I graduated, which is one of the biggest classical music festivals in the world. And I got to sing a main role. So I loved the whole aspect of acting and singing. Those two things together is what gave me such a passion for the art.
Do you remember, I guess, as you were being more introduced into opera and taking lessons, do you remember the first big role that you performed, the first kind of famous opera? But which production were you in?
Yeah. So what's funny is I can remember pretty much all of the roles I've ever done.
Mhm.
And the first thing I got to, sorry, my baby's moving. I'm pregnant, for those who didn't know, and I'm 36 weeks tomorrow. But it wasn't a role. The first, exciting development of me getting to be on stage and perform in an opera was when I was cast in the chorus at USC. And being a freshman and getting cast in the chorus is pretty rare because most of the people who are in the productions are either master's students or seniors. And so getting cast as a freshman was like, wow, this is amazing. And what was so funny about it was that I got cast it was for Magic Flute. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, it's like a sign. That's incredible. My first role which was with like the small, it was called the Chamber Opera of USC, was the name of it is The Medium. It's a small opera. It's like an operetta almost. Not that's the wrong term, but it's like an hour-long opera by Menotti. And I got to sing Mrs. Gobineau, and it was that was an interesting role. It's a very odd show. It's only about 45 minutes to an hour. But what was funny is then, how many years later, probably 5-6 years later, I sang the main role in The Medium, and I sang Monica. So, it all comes back around.
Do you remember when you were kind of growing up and listening to music kind of in your early teens and, sort of the memorable part about first really kind of discovering music? How did you take opera as a musical genre compared to, I guess, what maybe your friends were listening to, more contemporary music? And did you ever find it was difficult to understand the music, or did it kind of just come to you naturally?
I think with classical music, it's really all about exposure. I think if you've been exposed to it from the time you're a young person, you don't think about it as like, oh, this is hard to grapple with or hard to grasp. It's just like in your dialect, in a sense. You've been raised with it, so you're familiar with it. When I got older and I was studying music, I could understand it more. I could understand like why the music did this certain thing or that certain thing, but I wasn't ever intimidated by classical music. It was always something that was just around. And so I was like, okay, this is cool. This is different. And this might just be a weird quirk of my personality, but I always liked being a little bit different than my friends. And so the fact that they were listening to pop music and stuff that I couldn't stomach, I was like, oh, well, I'm different. I'm unique. I'm listening to something that no one else listens to. And that was fun for me. But opera is difficult if you've not been raised with it. And it's something that I have a big passion about trying to introduce it to people who have to make an effort more because they weren't raised with it. And there are ways that, I could go into now or not, that you can sort of familiarize yourself with it before jumping in both feet first, which can be overwhelming if you've never listened to it before.
The first opera that, I forget the age, but the first one that I really loved listening to, and there was a vinyl set in my parents' house with, I think Pavarotti was in it, but it was the Barber of Seville. And I found that to be very accessible. I was wondering if, from your perspective, if you had a favorite opera that you would kind of use as a gateway to introduce people to the genre.
Oh, yes. I have very many that I could recommend. Barber of Seville is a great one. It is really fun to listen to. Basically, my piece of advice with opera when you're just starting is that you need to listen to, like, choose 5 to 10 pieces, songs, whatever you want to call them, from the opera that you listen to before trying to listen to the whole thing. Because if you just listen to the whole thing and you're unfamiliar with it, it can feel like a wall of sound. You're just kind of like, oh my gosh, 2.5 hours of this, and I can't differentiate anything from anything else. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I always say, if you can go in and 3, 4, 5, 10 songs that are in the opera, they're called arias, but we'll call them songs for those who don't know. Then you're going to be able to go, oh, I remember that. Or like, oh, I recognize this, as opposed to just so much new for so long. And that can just be really exhausting as a listener. If you go to a concert, even for a band that you love, if they're playing all songs you've never heard, you're just going to be like, oh my gosh, like, I want to hear something I recognize. And so taking the time to do that is really important. So that preface was because I really generally recommend the Magic Flute, because it's a Singspiele, which means that it's songs interspersed with dialogue rather than sung through the entirety. So things are broken up more, which again is helpful when you are not used to the genre. But what's a very easy one is Carmen. Most people know at least 5 or 6 things from Carmen and don't even know that they know them. So there's really not a lot of, there's really not a lot of overhead for you to go sit down and choose your favorites from Carmen before going to see it, because you're already going to recognize the Toreador song. You're already going to recognize the habanera. There's like a million things from Carmen that are just in our I don't know, national dialogue that you hear like in movies all the time. And you'll be like, oh my gosh, that's where that's from. So Carmen is amazing for that reason. And then also the story of Carmen is like chef's kiss.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I guess I think it applies to classical music more broadly as well, but there's these little snippets and from different pieces, and Rigoletto is another one, I think, where, there's just things that are just put in movies that, you don't really think about, but subconsciously, you've heard it. And so if you kind of hear it in the more broader sense of an orchestra or of a recording, then it kind of familiarizes it and it ties it down a little bit.
Totally. Totally. I always say that there's 2 duets from operas that you will only ever associate with chocolate commercials. And I'm sure you know which ones I'm talking about. Like, as soon as they pop up, you'll be like, oh yeah, that is always played in like a Lindor commercial.
That's very true. And one thing that I guess, to go back to what you were talking about a little bit earlier, is when you were talking about how you like to be a little different from your friends and how they were listening to pop music that you couldn't stomach. And so I was just wondering if, around this time when you were kind of maybe not sneering, but I guess you were just kind of wanting to stand out, listen to your own thing than what was just on the radio. Did you perhaps, I guess, did it maybe occur to you, or were you also kind of thinking about how you prefer classical music because it's also just more interesting musically, rather than just the fact that it's different, that it offers more richness and complexity than because contemporary pop at the time?
I mean, yes, that's a big part of it. I would say that's more of it than it was me just being like, haha, I'm different. It's very easy to hear, even from an uneducated perspective, which I was totally uneducated about music theory until I was in college. So when you can tell that, pop music is not sophisticated, it's very simple, and that's all the same chordal structures, all the same, it's all produced by computers nowadays. And then you've got classical music, which is based on music theory and is also just so much more complex. And because of that, can bring you to tears, not because of the lyrics, which I think is what happens a lot with pop music nowadays. It's because the music itself is so glorious. Now, to be frank, to be clear, like I didn't only listen to classical music. I listened to a bunch of other genres, but not pop. Pop was like, modern pop. That was never on my radar. I wasn't interested. I didn't want to listen to. I didn't like that it was all. Most of it was dirty. It just didn't appeal to me. I was like, I'd rather listen to Mozart than listen to Katy Perry.
Did you listen to jazz at all growing up?
Absolutely. So my dad is a jazz pianist. Definitely jazz. I love jazz. I would say that jazz is probably what I listen to more frequently than classical. For a while, I had to kind of take a step back from listening to classical because it was my job. And so it wasn't like relaxing for me. But jazz has been, a through line of just always something that I've enjoyed. And that ranges the gamut from stuff like, I'm trying to think, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, but I'm also thinking instrumentalists like Oscar Peterson. So that kind of stuff always gave me it's so great. It's so amazing. And people are so good at the improvisation of it, which I always loved.
Yeah, I think for whatever reason, I guess maybe it's the lack of lyrics or the lack of a kind of accessible component that it never really kind of took off contemporarily as well in the last, because I mean, people today still listen to like classic rock. It's kind of still a popular thing, like the Beatles and British invasion music, that it's not, you won't call it contemporary now, but it's sort of still popular music. But then 50s and 40s like hard bop or like Art Blakey and these famous jazz musicians, they're still, I think, much more of a niche listening thing, right, than this even 60-year-old rock music. So it's I don't know, do you think of a reason or how you can kind of introduce people to these different genres or different styles that is not maybe their first choice, but just has so much to offer that people just aren't really paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as far as why jazz remains somewhat niche, I think it's very tied to its era in a sense. It's very like you think of Frank Sinatra, you think of a girl in a 50s style dress and a guy in a fedora. Like you don't picture that in a modern sense. I guess the Beatles, that's true too. You think of that as like very 60s, but it transfers a little bit more because pop music is stemmed in a lot of ways from the Beatles. Yeah. So I think that, jazz is still very much jazz. It didn't like change over time. It's retained its unique nature. And jazz is great for me, but part of that is because I also love that era. I love the 40s and the 50s. That's like a very attractive era to me. And so it's nostalgic, even though I never like lived in it. It's something that I'm like, oh, if I were in the 40s and 50s, this is what I would listen to. So I think what we can do to kind of get people more comfortable with music that they're not already being exposed to on a regular basis is exposing them to it. So, it's like actually, when you have people over, for example, when I have people over, I will put on that music in the background just so that it's something that they're hearing. And I think people generally like that as like a dinner party soundtrack. Now, it always makes me slightly sad when I realize that we live in an era, this is totally off topic, but I want to just briefly mention, please. We live in an era of background music. Like if you think about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that didn't exist. You had to go to a concert to hear music, or maybe you would have like some instrumentalists in the background playing a concert, but while people were dancing. But the idea of literally we put on music almost as just like sound in the background is so new in a sense. And it makes us take music for granted because we have it at our fingertips all the time. But that's off topic.
Well, no, I disagree. I think it's completely on topic, and it's such a great point that how I think the accessibility of music has made a lot of things like, I mean, dinner party background music, like you said, like a lot of really great recordings. Like I think I think the problem that people have with jazz often is that they associate it with music that would lend itself to dinner party background music. So I think, if you ever look at people's kind of, I guess vinyl has sort of become a hot thing over the last 10 years. And so there's a couple of records that are kind of just so ubiquitous that almost every person will just buy them. For example, one of them is the Miles Davis album, Kind of Blue,
Hmm.
which is a good album, right? It's a very good jazz album, but it's a more it's not a hard bop album. It's a very kind of mellow jazz record.
Hmm.
And this is kind of, I think, what people think of jazz, something that you can just not think about, have it in the background. It's a very smooth, atmospheric thing. But I mean, this is not at all what Miles Davis and Coltrane, what they were intending when they were doing this. And I think just, because of how we've almost grown accustomed to treat music like background noise, we don't really appreciate what it contains. We don't really sit down to actually listen to the record and listen to what's happening and in the recording and understand and appreciate it the same way.
Yeah, it is interesting that people don't just sit and listen to music anymore. I think there are I know a few audiophiles who like love their equipment. And so they'll like go and sit in their kind of studios and just listen. But most of us don't just listen to music. I think that maybe the only time, like our version of that would probably be the car. If you're riding in the car, you might have music playing, but it's still like slightly a distraction because you're driving at the same time. But I think you also made a good point, which I should have probably addressed is with jazz, is that I think there's like there's two subcategories for jazz. There's the jazz that's very improvisatory and like is, wiggling and waggling around with all the instruments, and doesn't feel like it has a melody. And then there's the jazz that's much more structured, which is like Mel Torme and, Ella, all those songs, Irving Berlin. I mean, Irving Berlin was early, but that stuff it is jazz. It's just improvisatory for the singer and a little bit for the band, but there's a very clear song. And I think that stuff is much more relatable for modern listeners than stuff that doesn't feel like it has a structure, even though it does, but it's hard to hear it. Now, I'll be honest, I'm somebody who prefers the more structured jazz. I do like that better. And I will say, I think that someone like Michael Bublé brought that back a little bit, because he was trying to kind of be in the vein of Frank Sinatra. The only problem with Michael Bublé is that he can't swing. So that makes things a little bit like more boxy, but people really liked Michael Bublé. And I think it gave them an opportunity to hear somebody modern doing something that's a little more old fashioned. And then they could be like, oh, I've heard this song before by Michael Bublé, but really maybe Frank Sinatra was the first person who recorded it. So I kind of want to listen to that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess speaking of, again, on the topic of kind of, listening to music for just the purpose of actually listening to it, do you, like, I guess in your house, whenever you have music on, do you find you ever have set a specific time just to listen to a record, or whether it's an opera or a classical recording or a jazz thing? Or is it, like you said, is it mostly just kind of on in the background sometimes?
I will say, I wish I did it more.
Yeah.
But there are certain albums, and I think it's more like musicals than anything. I do have a record player. My husband got that for me last year. And we go to the Goodwill to pick up records. That's where we always find our records. We don't like spend $35 on a new one. We generally most people are donating them, so we can get them for a couple dollars. And so a lot of people have old musicals, and I love musicals. So I'll put that on and I'll listen to it. But my problem is that I generally sing along. So maybe that's what makes it less of like an easy listening sort of session, because I'm like, I gotta sing with this. I love it.
Yeah. I think the nice thing with record players, and with even, I guess you can include CD players, but these kind of ways of physically listening to music is it makes it harder to manipulate the music. I think when you think about Spotify and Apple Music, they're wonderful platforms for finding and discovering music. But at least I think in most people's experiences, it's rare to listen to a whole album start to finish on these platforms. Usually, you click on your favorite song from a record and you say add to playlist or add to queue. And I mean, which is a great feature, but it's, when it comes to just listening to a single record the way the artist intended it to be done, or the conductor intended it, I think, in this case, that's the great thing with records is you put the needle on the outer groove and it just goes from start to finish, right? There's no easy way to really to skip around. And I think it kind of forces you to pay attention, to listen.
I totally agree. And on top of that, something that makes me really sad is that they're like addicted to only hearing a minute of a song.
Mm-hmm.
They'll listen to a minute and then they'll skip forward, or they'll like listen to the point where they're bored and then they'll skip forward. Whereas when you're listening on a record or a CD, generally you don't do that. I mean, for a record, for sure. Mm-hmm. CD, you can still do that. But with a record, you're just going to listen to the whole thing. And, it's good to have, I've been talking a lot lately on my channel about slow living, this idea mm-hmm. of just kind of embracing that you're not always going to get everything done and all of this kind of mentality. And one of those things is you don't have to skip through every song to get to every other song. Sometimes it's good to just listen, take your time and enjoy it for what mm-hmm. it is.
Yeah, I think a really interesting point that my friend David Rabai, he's on Twitter. He did a podcast with Rick Beato about music as well, and a really interesting observation from I guess their conversation that was made was that I think part of the reason why the younger generation, I guess teenagers, kids these days, they don't really they don't listen to music the same way kids would have done in the 60s and the 70s, is that I guess it hasn't really occurred to me before, but the kind of prevalence of video games is such an immersive medium and such an immersive form of entertainment that even more so than film or television, that it almost makes music seem boring because you have no interaction to music. You're kind of just sitting there. There's no visual component to it. It's basically just people, instruments are playing out of your speakers, and you have to sit and accept that you have nothing else to do but just focus on the sounds and the melodies. And mm-hmm. I guess when you're visual and your auditory sensors are used to something as engaging as a video game, you're kind of desensitized to anything else that you can experience, which is very interesting. It never occurred to me, but I think
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it even applies to opera as an art form. Opera is not a fast art form. Things are not going to be happening quickly. People are processing their human emotions in the most giant form possible and imaginable, both in the situation itself, which is exaggerated, and in the time span that they're taking to respond, right? So it's not somebody crying, cut to the next scene. It's somebody processing what may take an actual person in real life a minute. They're taking 5 to 10 minutes through aria, through a song to live out and to understand. It's their soliloquy. And if you're not patient, and if you can't sit there and go, oh, I'm being shown a reflection of myself magnified, which might actually allow me to like examine my own emotions and examine my own humanity, then you're going to be bored. I mean, it's really hard. But I also wanted to mention, now this is, again, sort of changing subjects, but you talking about video games and movies a little bit. It's just one of the interesting and fascinating things that I've realized in the last, 2 years, maybe 3 years, is that the classical music that is written today is not written for the concert hall. It's written for movies and video games.
Yeah.
And I think people don't kind of think about that so much because it's like, oh, it's a soundtrack. But actually, classical music is not the stuff that you think of as classical music anymore. You probably know it as the soundtrack to your favorite movie. And the stuff that is being written for the concert hall is terrible often because it's exactly. It's something that's totally unrelatable to somebody who hasn't sat in a classroom learning music theory for 5 years and understands what you're trying to do, as opposed to somebody who can understand just love the music for what it is. Don't get me started on modern classical music. Not a fan most of the time.
I think people writing it often don't remember that most of the people in the audience didn't go to Juilliard and didn't go to music school.
Yeah.
So
like, maybe don't look down on the people that you want to patronize your art. I don't know.
But I think you make a great point, because so I listen to, I guess I work from home predominantly. I'm a software developer. And as I work, usually I have the classical radio station, the local FM radio station in the background. And in the morning, there's a segment called Anderson's Jukebox on this Toronto FM station, and effectively they just take requests, and something like maybe 60%, like a ridiculously high number of percentages of requests whenever it's a younger person calling, is inevitably a film score, is a piece from Jurassic Park, a film from Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and I mean, as a listener, it gets tiring eventually to hear these things over and over again. But yeah, it entirely speaks to your point that a lot of, I think, almost subconsciously, maybe not realizing it, a lot of people of the newer generation of younger people. I guess I'm not that old myself, but I kind of, in my head, I think I'm at least 65. But a lot of, I think, younger people who don't actively listen to classical music, they love a lot of film scores that they grew up with. And totally. I think what they also maybe don't realize is that a lot of the very famous film scores by like John Williams and so forth, they were heavily influenced by very famous, Baroque and Romantic classical pieces.
No, John Williams is a master at stealing from Gustav Holst. If you ever want to listen to the soundtrack for Star Wars and Superman, but not listen to them, then listen to Gustav Holst, the Planets. That's pretty much where everything comes from. John Williams just kind of lifted it out and put it in those movies and made some slight changes.
I don't know if it's how influenced it was, but it just occurred to me some time ago. I remember the this part of the score for the Pixar film Up. There was like a very memorable opening sequence, and I was listening to Johann Strauss's Waltz at some point, and it sounded, at least to me, it just sounded like it was very heavily influenced, like it was very, very, very similar to it. But
I'll have to check that one out. Yeah. Yeah, Michael Giacchino is the composer for Up. There's been like 3 composers in the last few years, I feel like, that have taken on a lot of work. I think his first name is Alexander Desplat. Is that his name? I believe his name is Alexander Desplat. He's been, which I'm probably butchering his name, but it looks like Desplat. He has written scores for a ton of people. And then you've got Michael Giacchino, who's also written scores for a ton of people.
Yeah, and I mean, and then years before, there was Henry Mancini, of course, who wrote so many great memorable scores like Pink Panther, probably most of people's favorite 20th century films, or his music. So yeah, I mean, it's sometimes overlooked, I think, how great the music stands out on its own apart from the film, because we always kind of think of them as a pair.
Well, the thing that's really fascinating is, more importantly, if you were to remove and lift out the score completely from a movie, you don't realize, unless it's pointed out to you, how much music changes a film. The emotional points in films that you think of as like, wow, it's the actors, wow, it's the director, wow, it's the cinematography. Yes, it's all those things. But if you don't have that crescendo of music underneath, tell me if you cry. I would be surprised. I
remember there was an interview with, I think it was with Peter Jackson, in the mid 2000s, and they were talking about it, retrospectively looking at the Lord of the Rings films, and he very openly conceded that he was saying, if something like 55-60% of the appeal or the success of those films was just entirely based on the wonderful score by Howard Shore. And it's impossible to imagine those movies without that music.
Yeah, no, Howard Shore. I don't know his music, all of his other music that well, but I remember my father saying after we saw it, he was like, this is going to be his magnum opus. He's like, before was never as good, after is never going to be as good. This is like his masterpiece. And I totally agree. I mean, one of the things that I love about Lord of the Rings, as you know, compared to a lot. Okay, let's think. So we're getting into like the things that I'm interested in. Hans Zimmer is also a big composer. He works with Christopher Nolan a lot. But the thing with Hans Zimmer is that he uses music to build an ambiance. You can't hum Hans Zimmer. Hans Zimmer is like, he's wanting to build stress or tension underneath using instruments, but it isn't something that is a theme. The most interesting musical scores to me are those that have themes. A very famous one is Gone with the Wind. The themes in Gone with the Wind are incredible, and the way that they keep coming back in different iterations to show different emotional tones is amazing. Howard Shore, the reason that the score for Lord of the Rings is so beautiful and so memorable is because he used themes. And so Isengard had a theme, Hobbiton had a theme, Rivendell had a theme, and it made the movie feel like you could recognize each place, not only visually, but auditorily. And that's such an amazing tool for music. And we talk about that. This was something that occurred before Wagner. I'm not a huge Wagner fan, but in Wagner's music, he came up with the term leitmotif, which he used in the same way. It was, there are motifs to represent different people and different characters. And that kind of thing. There's a language in music that is so effective and can be used so wonderfully. And I guess you can say Hans Zimmer's using a different part of the language, but it's not my personal preference.
Yeah. I think what you were saying about how you can't hum Hans Zimmer is very, I think the thing about that is it very closely ties the music to the film itself. And I think with, Howard Shore, for example, or with, Gone with the Wind, is you can take away the music and listen to it on its own, but you can't listen to, nobody listens to Hans Zimmer music on its own. You just have like these booming bass sounds, and just, it doesn't make any sense without the visual aspect. So, I mean, exactly. I think it works well in the context of the film, and it kind of definitely, it produces the desired effects, right? But as a piece of music on its own, I think it's a very different kind of thing.
I agree. I mean, that's, I think, why John Williams was so successful, because he did motifs so well. I mean, Superman's theme was so famous. Even Harry Potter is so like, everything in there is so unique, and every theme has a place, and it makes a film feel, it sounds interesting, but I just thought of it right now. It almost makes a film feel homey, because you're like, oh, I know this place, and I not only know it because of how it looks, but of how it sounds.
Yeah. And I think to your earlier point, that you can, once you see, these films maybe 2 or 3 times, the music is so memorable that to a point you can only hear the film score and you will immediately identify, the scene you're in. It's like if you've seen, a ballet like the Nutcracker, I'm sure, many times, once you hear a piece of music from the Nutcracker, you will immediately see the dance or the piece that accompanies it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely.
So I was wondering this, we talked about this a little while back about listening to music, and how right now, I guess the car is the main place for a lot of people, which is true. And so I was wondering if you remember when you were a child, when you're kind of growing up, do you remember what was the popular, the most common music that was being played in the car?
Yeah, so we definitely listened to classical for sure. Musical theater was a huge one. 1776 was great. All of Rodgers and Hammerstein, all of Sondheim. I was thinking Sweeney Todd, all of Sondheim. We kind of started to listen to some more modern stuff like a little bit later, but mostly we were listening to musical theater up until about the 80s, and then not so much. And we would listen to the stuff that my dad grew up on. So that was kind of my jam, was like the Doobie Brothers, Blood, Sweat and Tears, and of course jazz. So there were a lot of genres available to us, but nothing that any one of my friends listened to. I mean, they were listening, if they were listening to something kind of older, it was like Nirvana or, you know what I mean? It wasn't Bread or Harper's Bazaar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I guess, so did you find that, I guess when you were listening to a lot of this music that your parents were exposing you, did you ever think, I guess, did you ever have like this thought that you wanted to be kind of different from what your parents were listening to and find your own thing even from that, and kind of, rebel against the older generation?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Because we were in the era before streaming, I don't think I even knew where to start. It wasn't like I could go to, maybe I could have gone to the library, but we didn't really like go to the library as a family, which I think is such a like missed opportunity now as an adult. Going to the library is awesome. But so I wouldn't have known where to find other music besides what I'd been introduced to by my family. And I'm sure there were times, I mean, I remember that there were times that my friends all knew a song and I didn't. And maybe I was like, oh, I wish I kind of fit in more. But then I would listen to the song and I was like, I hate this. This is not something I enjoy. But I kind of would want to listen to stuff that other people were listening to more than I was, even if it was, funnily enough, like the Beatles or Nirvana. My family did not listen to those things. So even though, the Beatles isn't new at all, it's something that's so much in, just in the air that the fact that I didn't really listen to the Beatles at all was clearly something that like stood out, that I listened to all this old music, but not the Beatles. So even though this year, actually, Jacob and I listened to the entire discography of the Beatles.
Okay. Well, I'm curious to ask, so what were your main takeaways from this this journey?
We did not love it. There
Really?
were some, and look, I know it is so controversial to not like the Beatles. I'm aware. But we listened to all of it. And there are definitely some songs that are great, that stand out. And you're like, that's a really great song. But so much of what they did, especially their early stuff, was really repetitive and just kind of like the same sort of thing over and over and over again, that I just kind of, you can pump out a lot of content, that's great. But it wasn't interesting to me. I know that's not a popular opinion.
Well, I think part of the kind of the legacy of the Beatles, I think part of it, it's important to view in the context of what else was on the radio in the early 60s in England. And I think and not just what else was on the radio, but the way that music was being created, I think is really important to consider, because before the Beatles came along, it was very much the norm to you record like pop standards. You record like the Everly Brothers were around, and like this was, and Elvis was kind of gone. He was like 50s act, but a lot of the big the top charting artists, almost all of them would not write their own songs, because record labels, they just wouldn't take the risk of letting they would think that there's people who are really good at singing and performing, and there's people who are songwriters, and these are separate entities, and they just wouldn't risk letting artists do both of these. And it was largely the Beatles that really just pressured the label. And then they were with Parlophone, which was basically like they would have they put like comic acts on the records. Like, it was a very lesser known label at the time. And Beatles were turned down by Decca initially. And so they weren't like, they showed promise, but they weren't, a huge risk for the label. And so they kind of let them put on, I think it was Please Please Me was the first record. And so they let them do originals. And when these took off and this became, the whole Beatlemania sensation, this really paved the way for like the Rolling Stones and other artists to also stop doing covers of other people's songs and pick up songwriting. So, I mean, this is I think, in retrospect, maybe stuff like Love Me Do isn't like something that Leonard Bernstein would have conducted, but Yeah, I think in the context of what they were doing, I think it had its own sort of merit as a piece of innovation. And then, beyond that, I think what's really interesting is how, these days people don't listen to albums as a whole, and I think singles have kind of become the big way to release music. And so before the Beatles, that was kind of the norm as well. Is there was no idea of like a cohesive album, of where the songs follow a similar theme, or and then there's just a kind of statement that traces through from the first side to the back. And again, that was also very much a Beatles thing, was to kind of create records like Rubber Soul, Rubber Soul. I don't know, Sergeant Pepper's obviously was the biggest one, and again, this was very much then kind of led to albums like the Pet Sounds from the Beach Boys, and many other ones. And so the packaging albums, again, somewhat traces to the Beatles. So it's fair to say that I think some of their songs are repetitive, aren't as great, and I think a lot of it is kind of trapped in this larger Beatles mythology, kind of like greatest thing of all time pantheon, and it all kind of, so when you take the discography, you're expecting every song to be like this kind of musical masterpiece. And so yeah, I could understand how some stuff doesn't live up to that, but yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are important to kind of view in the context of when they were being made.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that they're influential. Obviously,
Mhm.
they've done some. They changed a lot in the music industry, and there are some. I'll be honest. I think that the singer-songwriter thing is like, it's actually not. It's not my favorite development. I think that there are some singer-songwriters who are great, like Carole King, fantastic. I love her. She only released maybe one album as her own singer, or maybe two, but Tapestry was
Tapestry, yeah.
Tapestry was her most famous. Billy Joel was a singer-songwriter, I think.
Yes.
And I like Billy Joel as well. But we also have people will hate me for saying this, but we also have people like Taylor Swift, who's like, I'm a singer-songwriter. And I'm like, yeah, congratulations. Like, that's nice. And I think that, we've also lost out for a lot on the relationship between the songwriters and the singers. Nowadays we have, of course, there are a lot of singers who sing people's songs, but the songs that are written not by songwriters. They're often not. They are often written by production companies who, run it by some, 20 different people and say, okay, is this something you would listen to on the radio? So that I don't think is like the most positive thing, but also I will be honest, I'm not like the most educated on the entire history of the Beatles. So I shouldn't comment too much on it because I don't know that much about it. But it just wasn't to me, just as a listener of their music. I'm somebody who would probably prefer quality over quantity, and a lot of it I felt like was quantity over quality. And there are a lot of good songs that the Beatles did release. What I generally prefer are their acoustic stuff. No, I don't like the stuff that is more, Ringo just playing the beat in the back, which I know I've heard that he is an incredible, like metronomically perfect drummer, or that he also like introduced some interesting drum patterns that would not have been thought of at the time. So I know I recognize that Ringo is like a great drummer, but it's often very just, the same thing over and over. I'm like a Buddy Rich fan. I like hearing that kind of thing.
I mean, he was definitely I think he was a good fit for the Beatles. I don't think he was, the greatest drummer in the history of music, but I think he was creative at certain times, and he was right for the band. I think most kind of very successful bands we remember today, most of the members are kind of just the right people for the right group in the right band. I mean, someone like Charlie Watts, fits perfectly into the Rolling Stones, probably would not have been a good drummer for Led Zeppelin, right? At the same time.
Right.
And so, it was interesting. So, you brought up both Billy Joel and Taylor Swift. Do you, how do you view this I guess this progression or maybe regression could be a better term for it of pop music throughout the last, I guess, half century or so, and how, what do you think it is that kind of got us from, New York State of Mind and Vienna and these kind of really great songs that we, still remember listening to today to, I know Taylor Swift has a lot of fans, and I'm sure there's some richness in her discography, but I can't profess to be a big fan, but, and I don't think I'm sure that, I think there's even, much worse pop music on the radio these days. And so I think Taylor Swift, she plays the guitar, and I personally, I appreciate a lot more than I think a lot of the famous pop artists who don't even play a musical instrument. So yeah, I kind of just more broadly, what do you think about how music has changed over the last 50 years, and what's kind of, what has driven this change in the direction that it's gone in?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I have to think about that one, because so much has changed in the last 50 years. I'm sure much of it has to do with technology, just that increase in technology, the increase of what concerts are like now. Concerts are first of all, let's take the fact that concerts are where you make money, because you can't make money off of selling records anymore, because everything is just put onto streaming right away. So now concerts have to be not just something you do to publicize your album or to perform live for fun. It's what you do to make money. So you better fill out this stadium, and that $150 ticket better be worth it. And so you're putting on these concerts that are like huge, and I don't even know how much of it is actually about the music. I've been to one concert at a stadium. I went to see Imagine Dragons with my sister a million years ago. And it was, it's a light show. You can't hear anything. You can hear it because it's blasting, but you have to wear literal headphones to cover your ears so you don't damage your hearing. And it's so loud, and there's lights and screens, and it's I don't know how much of it is about the music, really. And so when it's not about the music, when it's about going for the experience of being around other people who are all experiencing the same thing as you are, I think it really does change the focus of what the music is about. And if it's going to be something that is like that, it's going to need to be a beat. What are you going to hear and do with people when you're in a giant crowd? You're going to be dancing to a beat, and it's not necessarily about sitting down and listening to Vienna. Vienna is like, it's an emotional kind of song. You're not sitting there crying in a concert. You're standing up, waving your phone or whatever else it is. And it's much more focused on, I think that the real thing is it's like much more focused on music today, it's like, I'm trying to think of another word beside experience, but like on this feeling of how is this affecting my brain in a weird way, like rather than how am I interacting with this? How am I taking this in? What am I feeling emotionally? Not just almost in a sense feeling physically, because so much of modern music is literally like thumping. So I think that might be a lot of it.
And I think even over the last, maybe it was 10 years or 15 years, the concept of the DJ was very popularized to a point where, and I don't know if this was still a thing in the 90s, but there's celebrities who are not, I think they call themselves musicians, but people who are just identify as DJs. And there are like clubs of tens of thousands in these different cities, and they put on these light shows, and then the DJs just play music, but they sell the tickets. On the ticket stub, you'll have like Dead Mouse or something. I don't know. It's not really the kind of music I listen to, but it's, to your point, a lot of it is just part of the physical experience of kind of interacting with whoever else is in the crowd, or who you're dancing with around you, and with the lights and with the beat, basically. And it's very different from, I guess, the concerts that could have been put on 30, 40 years ago, when all you mostly had was instruments on the stage, right? That you can recreate your music.
Yeah, I've a lot of this I do come from like a semi-political perspective, having read like Brave New World. It makes me
Mhm.
think of stuff like that, where it's like we're in a situation where people, and even just talking about, trying to remember, I think it was in The Righteous Mind
Mhm.
by Jonathan Haidt, just that people are looking for religious experiences outside of religion. And so one of the ways you can accomplish that is by being in a giant group with a lot of people doing the same thing physically. So if you're all jumping up and down at the same time, and maybe you're also on some sort of drug or alcohol, like it can be very intoxicating,
Mhm.
and it makes you feel like you've had this higher experience, even if the music itself is not very good, as opposed
Mhm.
to, in the past, we had religion was religion, and going to listen to music, it might bring you closer to God, but it would be because the music itself was so glorious that you
Mhm.
were like grateful to have heard it, and you were grateful to have seen the beauty of God that in that musical expression.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess we had Bach, and we had these beautiful hymns, and yeah, it's a very interesting point. I guess I never really thought about it that way, and about an experience that's kind of more parallels trying to create a religious experience. But
Mhm.
with I guess what I've kind of wondered as well is how with how different musical styles and genres, they kind of ebb and flow, and they go in and out of fashion. And every 20 or so, maybe 10 years, you have one type of genre that becomes outdated. Do you do you have any thoughts about where music could go in the future? Do you think there's any kind of sign that things could get better, or could get more in? At least when I say better, I think to kind of put a more a quantitative term on it, I really just mean more musically interesting. I mean, just beyond just being kind of a thumping beat and three or four chords that are repeated, just kind of more musical richness. Or do you think that maybe in terms of music and culture more broadly, are things just kind of going to get further and further dumbed down?
It's a difficult question because it's always hard to predict the future.
Mhm.
But I think that, I hope that music starts to take a turn for more complex,
Mhm.
themes, and is more beautiful. And I think it really just depends on where we're at as a society, in the sense of like, I don't think, post in a post COVID world, or even in the COVID world, it was like, I don't think people were, there were two options. Option one was, okay, well, we have nothing better to do. Maybe I will invest time, from a musical perspective. Maybe I'll invest time in teaching myself something new, or learning something new about music, and enjoying that. Or you have the other option, which is, God, this is so stressful. I really can't take on another thing. So I want to listen to dumber music. I want to
Mhm.
listen to stupider things. I want to watch less intensive, movies. I want to do
Mhm.
stuff that's just not going to take up any extra brain space. So I think if, as a society, we get to a point where we're like, I think I want to improve more over time, and I want to listen to things that are going to better me and make me grow as a person, then we'll see an
Mhm.
improvement in, and I'll make it qualitative, an improvement in
Yeah.
music. But I think if people tend to go down the path, which is the path of least resistance, of, I don't want to take on anything else, I don't want to be stressed, I just want to listen to music that doesn't bother me, then maybe not.
Yeah. I think that the reason I'm a little bit skeptical about it is largely, I think, in some ways, or in many ways, I think the kind of direction of music and film, I think, kind of mirrors each other. And I think, usually, I think if you have very interesting and kind of deep movies and films, I think, they're both reflections of culture and kind of what people want to consume. And I think the way Hollywood and films have been heading is not great. I mean, I think there's been a lot of great entertainment here and
Oh
there,
my
but
gosh, I agree. We've been trying to go to see a movie, and I looked at the list of what was out. I was
mhm,
like, there is literally nothing I want to
yeah,
see.
it's almost maybe not depressing, but it's just sad. I mean, I think there's a specific, the way the films are produced obviously is based on what the production companies will think will make money and will make a return on on their investment in the films. And it's just, I don't know, 4 or 5 different superhero films at a time are in theater. And, I don't want to, cast any aspersions on Marvel or DC. I'm sure, they make some entertaining movies, but it's not, you're not watching like Casablanca. It's not a very, the stories are not that rich. I mean, it's pretty much the same story every single time. It's, you have protagonists and antagonists, a few clashes, and then protagonists will prevail.
Right.
And it seems to be like, this is the market. This is what people want to see. And this is what is in theaters. I mean, occasionally there'll be something interesting. Like there was the film adaptation of Macbeth by Joel Cohen, which I think was really good.
Who was in that one? Was that the, because
Denzel
I know
Washington.
Michael Fassbender was in one a couple
No,
of
this is a new one. This is Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand.
Oh,
It's a black and white film.
Okay.
And so I do film reviews at the Washington Examiner, and
Nice.
so I'm watching a lot of these, and this one was like a really, really wonderful film. But like, this wasn't even in theaters. You had to watch this on like Apple Plus streaming, because it was just, who's going to watch Macbeth today? I mean, how many people are actually interested?
Yeah.
So if you go to theaters, there's like, Spider-Man was there, and I forget all of them, but it's, like I said, it's just it's repetitive the way, I think a lot of modern music is repetitive. I think films have kind of followed the same thing. And I think there will be a niche kind of audience that wants more interesting things, and, there will be a catering for them. But I think more broadly, things will just be more and more accessible, I think, for a while.
I tend to agree with you. And I think what will end up happening is what always ends up happening. People get more, like, you'll find a group that's interested and will pick up
Mhm.
whatever they're interested in, and then maybe hopefully they'll teach it to their children, and we'll see. But Zoomers I don't have the most confidence in.
Mhm.
So
Well, Abby, thank you very much for joining me on this conversation, and I think it was very interesting. So if any closing thoughts you want to leave the audience about your channel or whatever you're working on in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love if you guys would consider subscribing to my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
It's Classically Abby. You can also find me on all social media at Classically Abby. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, pretty much everywhere. And if you want to get access to my exclusive content, where I write a weekly article and have a book club and have a podcast, then you can head over to my Substack newsletter. So that's classicallyabby.substack.com.
Thank you very much. I noticed you were speaking of your the book club. Was it Catch 22 that you're reading?
Yeah, so we just read Catch 22. We're about to do our book club just this week. Never read it before. It was not easy. So I'm excited to hear what everyone thinks about it, because like I said, I'd never read it before. And I think I went in not totally knowing what it was, and how it's not linear at all.
Mm-mm.
And if you are not prepared for that, you're like, wait, what? But what I've learned about reading books like that, not that I believe Catch 22 is on the same level as like some Russian literature that I've read, but when you're reading a book that it can feel sort of overwhelming or confusing, this again off topic, I apologize.
No, please.
Something I've found is very helpful and very useful is to either watch like a film version of it, or watch the TV miniseries of it, just so that you have context clues throughout the book. And so there was a mini series of Catch 22 on Hulu that I started watching about a third of the way through reading Catch 22, just because I was like, I think this will give me some context. And it really did. It just clarified some of the characters for me, and it clarified some of the narrative, and it just can give you a little bit of extra help when you're trying to understand everything that's happening.
I think once you kind of get a hang of what's happening, though, I think the humor is really good. I found it to be a really funny book.
I mean, it's absolutely like satirical in every moment.
Yeah, like when there was, I forget the character, but there was, I think someone was like wounded, and then the officer was trying to convince him to say that he was wounded in battle so that he can get a medal.
Yeah.
And,
So the main
yeah.
character is Yossarian,
Mhm.
and there's Colonel Cathcart and Colonel
Okay.
Corn, and
Major,
yeah,
major,
it's
major, and
major.
yeah.
No, it is funny. It's also interesting to know the history of Joseph Heller,
Mhm.
which I just recently like learned about and kind of understand the context for it, because apparently he said, none of this was my experience in World War II, which
Mhm.
is interesting. Then it's just actually commentary. It's not him
Yeah.
working through, his own experience in
Mhm.
war. It's him wanting to comment on something even though it wasn't his experience. And I think that kind of changes the color of the book a bit.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I guess, a kind of similar war novel that's a little bit more personal experience based, but also satirical. If you haven't read that one yet, Slaughterhouse-Five from Kurt Vonnegut.
So that's so funny you say that, because I thought to myself, I don't think I read Slaughterhouse-Five. I think I read another one of his books. Don't
He
remember.
has many.
I know he has so
Yeah.
many, and I don't remember which one it was. I think it was something in the Cradle.
Oh, Cats in the Cradle?
Was it just Cats in the
Or
Cradle?
Cats, or just Cat's Cradle. I think Cats in the Cradle was
The
that
song.
song. Yeah, I think Cat's Cradle, just Cat's Cradle is the Kurt Vonnegut book. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I read Cat's Cradle, and I remember I said this to my husband like 2 nights ago. I said to him, "This really reminds me of Kurt Vonnegut."
Yeah.
So,
Mhm. But okay, I think we can wrap. We covered music, we got movies, and we even did some books. So I think this was a great chat. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.